In the fog-shrouded hollows of northern Appalachia, where the mountains hold their secrets close, and the Spanish moss hangs from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, a discovery was made that would pry open one of the most unsettling chapters of American history. In the spring of 2023, a team of surveyors, tasked with mapping the forgotten grounds of the long-defunct Hollowcrest Institute for Wayward Youth, stumbled upon an anomaly. It was a series of shallow, unmarked depressions in the earth, hidden beneath a century of leaf litter and neglect. What they unearthed there in the cold, damp soil was a chilling testament to a horror long since buried and silenced: the skeletal remains of over 100 individuals, most of them children. Official records for the Institute were sparse, sealed, or had mysteriously vanished in a courthouse fire decades ago, but recently uncovered private documents, a collection of journals and letters thought lost to time, paint a picture so grim, so systematically evil, that it challenges everything we thought we knew about the pastoral charities of a bygone era. This is not just a story of a forgotten tragedy. It is the story of the Hollowcrest family, a trio of leaders who, under the guise of benevolence, orchestrated a reign of terror, their prestigious institution a mere facade for a monstrous criminal enterprise. The truth of what transpired within those fortress-like walls has been clawing its way to the surface for over 100 years, and tonight, we will finally let it speak. But I must warn you, this channel is not for everyone. We delve into the shadows that history prefers to forget. If you are a brave soul, a seeker of the unvarnished truth, then you have found your community. Subscribe now, activate all notifications, and let us know in the comments where you are watching from, as we join together to explore the dark history of the Hollowcrest family. The story begins not with a crime, but with a promise, a grand vision announced in the autumn of 1888. It was a promise delivered from the silver tongue of Alistair Hollowcrest, the family's charismatic patriarch and the public face of their ambitious project. Standing before a congregation of the region's wealthiest patrons, his voice, a resonant baritone accustomed to commanding attention, echoed with conviction and moral authority. He spoke of the plight of the city's forgotten children, the orphans, the vagrants, the so-called wayward youth, who haunted the peripheries of polite society. He painted a verbal masterpiece of their salvation, a sanctuary nestled deep in the countryside, far from the squalor and temptations of urban life. This sanctuary would be the Hollowcrest Institute, a place not of punishment, but of transformation. "We shall build more than a school," he declared, his gaze sweeping across the rapt faces of his audience. "We shall build a future. We will take these lost lambs, these diamonds in the rough, and through discipline, education, and honest labor, we will mold them into pillars of a new, righteous generation." The vision was intoxicating, a perfect antidote to the anxieties of the Gilded Age, a time of stark social inequality and moral uncertainty. The donations poured in, a torrent of wealth from industrialists and society matrons eager to purchase a piece of Alistair's noble dream. Within 2 years, the Hollowcrest Institute rose from the valley floor, a formidable structure of dark, locally quarried stone and severe, Gothic, revival architecture. Its windows were tall and narrow, like the eyes of a hawk, and its central tower loomed over the surrounding landscape, a constant, watchful presence. To the outside world, it was a fortress of virtue, a testament to Christian charity. Its isolation was framed as a benefit, a way to shield its young wards from the corrupting influences of the world. But for those who would come to know its secrets, the isolation was not a shield, it was a cage. The very design of the building, celebrated for its grandeur, would later be described in a survivor's suppressed testimony as being built not to keep the world out, but to keep the screams in. The Institute's remote location, miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a single winding dirt road, was a key element of its design. It ensured that the Hollowcrest family would have absolute control, their authority unchallenged, their methods unobserved. The dense, ancient forests that surrounded the property became a natural barrier, muffling the sounds of the world, and, in turn, muffling the sounds of the Institute itself. The idyllic landscape, so beautifully described in the Institute's fundraising pamphlets, was in reality a character in the unfolding horror, its beauty a cruel irony that masked the darkness at its heart. The fog that so often blanketed the Hollow was not just a meteorological phenomenon. It was a shroud, a veil that hid the truth in plain sight. This carefully constructed image of piety and progress was the first and most crucial layer of the Hollowcrest family's deception, a masterpiece of public relations that allowed them to operate with impunity for nearly 2 decades, their crimes hidden behind a veneer of unimpeachable respectability. The world saw a beacon of hope in the wilderness. It would be years before anyone suspected it was, in fact, a charnel house. The Hollowcrest family was not a sprawling dynasty, but a tight, insular triad, each member a vital component in a perfectly calibrated machine of deceit and control. At its center was Alistair, the charismatic leader, the architect of the family's public image. He was a man who seemed to have stepped directly from the pages of a Victorian novel, with a mane of silvering hair, a piercing gaze, and a voice that could soothe a crying child or condemn a sinner with equal, mesmerizing effect. He was a master of performance, his every gesture, every sermon, every public address, a calculated study in persuasive power. He quoted scripture as easily as he breathed, his speeches weaving a tapestry of moral obligation and divine purpose that left his benefactors feeling not just charitable, but chosen. Alistair rarely involved himself in the day-to-day operations of the Institute. His domain was the outside world, the world of money, influence, and reputation. He was the rainmaker, the one who ensured the coffers were always full, and that any inconvenient questions from legislators or journalists were deftly deflected with an appeal to his unimpeachable character. He was a ghost within his own institution, a distant, godlike figurehead whose rare appearances were treated as momentous occasions by the staff and wards alike. This distance was intentional, a carefully maintained buffer that insulated him from the grim realities of the work being done in his name. He provided the philosophy, the justification, the moral cover that allowed the others to carry out their horrific tasks without question. His genius was in making cruelty seem like an act of grace. Then there was the second pillar of the triumvirate, Alistair's younger sister, Dr. Evelyn Hollowcrest, the methodical specialist. Where Alistair was all warmth and expansive rhetoric, Evelyn was cold, precise, and pathologically private. She had received a medical education from one of the few institutions that would admit women, a fact the family often touted as proof of their progressive ideals. But Evelyn's interest in medicine was not driven by a desire to heal. It was driven by a chilling, dispassionate curiosity about the mechanics of the human body and mind. She was the how-to expert of the family's dark enterprise. At the Hollowcrest Institute, she was in charge of the infirmary and what was euphemistically called the advancement program, a series of experimental treatments designed to cure the supposed moral and psychological defects of the wards. She was a woman of science, or so she claimed, and she documented her work with meticulous, almost obsessive detail. Her private journals, discovered decades later and forming the core of the recently unearthed documents, are a testament to her detached cruelty. They are filled not with patient charts, but with data points, not with case studies, but with experimental logs. In her spidery, precise handwriting, she recorded dosages, behavioral responses, and the physiological effects of her therapies, with the same emotional remove one might use to document the habits of insects. She saw the children not as individuals, but as a collection of variables, a raw material from which she could extract knowledge. She was the one who perfected the methods of control, the chemical cocktails that induced compliance, the dietary restrictions that sapped the will, the psychological manipulations that broke the spirit. While Alistair sold the world a dream, Evelyn was in the laboratory, turning that dream into a living nightmare. The final, and perhaps most critical member of the group was Silas Hollowcrest, the cousin of Alistair and Evelyn, who served as the practical enforcer and manager. If Alistair was the voice and Evelyn was the mind, Silas was the fist. He was a large, physically imposing man with a stark, unsmiling face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He had no patience for Alistair's lofty speeches or Evelyn's scientific jargon. His world was one of logistics, discipline, and order. Silas was the one who ran the institute. He managed the staff, a collection of downtrodden and easily intimidated locals who learned quickly not to ask questions. He oversaw the work schedules, which were designed to be grueling and exhausting, leaving the wards with little energy for rebellion. He was in charge of security, ensuring the high stone walls and locked gates were more than just symbolic. And he was the one who administered the corrections, the brutal punishments for even the smallest infractions. His methods were direct and savage, designed to create an atmosphere of pervasive fear. Unlike Evelyn's calculated cruelty, Silas's was born of a brutish pragmatism. He was the one who handled the problems, the defiant children, the escape attempts, the ones who simply wouldn't break. His solutions were swift, final, and always undocumented. In the Institute's official ledgers, these children were listed as having been reunited with distant relatives or having succumbed to sudden illness. Silas was the one who made them disappear. Together, these three formed a corrupt and horrifyingly effective collective. Alastair's charisma provided the shield, Evelyn's perverted science provided the methods, and Silas's brute force provided the control. They were a closed loop of evil, each one enabling the others, their shared secrets binding them together in a conspiracy of blood and silence. Their family bond was not one of affection, but of shared culpability, a dark pact sealed within the stone walls of their monstrous creation. They were not merely criminals. They were the architects of a self-contained universe built on suffering, a universe they ruled as absolute, unquestioned gods. To the casual observer, and indeed to the wealthy patrons who funded it, life at the Hollowcrest Institute appeared to be a model of structure and purpose. The public facade was a masterpiece of orchestrated propaganda, meticulously maintained by the Hollowcrest family. Lavishly illustrated pamphlets were sent to donors quarterly, showcasing smiling, ruddy-cheeked children engaged in wholesome activities. There were photographs of boys learning carpentry, their faces earnest and focused as they planed wood in a sunlit workshop. There were images of girls in neat, matching pinafores, tending to rows of vibrant vegetables in a sprawling garden, their baskets overflowing with the bounty of their honest labor. The accompanying text, penned by Alastair himself, was a symphony of uplifting prose. It spoke of transforming idle hands into industrious ones, and instilling the virtues of discipline and self-reliance in a generation lost to the temptations of the modern world. The Institute even published a monthly newsletter, the Hollowcrest Herald, which featured heartwarming stories of student achievement, testimonials from supposedly grateful wards, and Evelyn's scholarly-sounding articles on the moral benefits of a regimented diet. This carefully curated image was the bedrock of the entire operation, a powerful illusion that disarmed suspicion and kept the donations flowing. The illusion was further bolstered by the Institute's annual Founders' Day celebration. For this one day each year, the gates of Hollowcrest would swing open to a select group of benefactors and local dignitaries. They would be treated to a meticulously rehearsed pageant, with the children performing songs of gratitude and staging morality plays that reinforced the Institute's virtuous mission. The visitors would tour the pristine, public-facing areas, the grand dining hall with its polished floors, the immaculate chapel with its stained glass windows depicting scenes of redemption, and the showcase classrooms where students would be observed diligently reciting their lessons. Silas, for this one day, would trade his usual scowl for a semblance of stern but fair stewardship, while Dr. Evelyn would graciously explain her nutritional theories to admiring society wives. Alastair would preside over the entire affair like a benevolent king, his speeches moving the guests to tears and, more importantly, to open their checkbooks. But this entire presentation was a carefully constructed stage play. The sunlit workshop was only used for photographs. The real work took place in a damp, cold cellar where boys were forced to assemble cheap goods for a pittance, the profits from which went directly into the Hollowcrest private accounts. The vibrant gardens were tended for show. The ward's actual diet consisted of a thin, tasteless gruel, a scientifically calibrated formula devised by Evelyn to maintain docility and prevent physical development. The smiling children in the pamphlets were carefully selected and coached, their expressions of happiness a mask for the terror that governed their daily lives. The reality behind the facade was a grim, unyielding routine designed to break the individual and enforce total compliance. The day began before dawn, with a clanging bell that jolted the children from their sleep in crowded, unheated dormitories. They were given 5 minutes to dress in their rough, threadbare uniforms before being marched to the dining hall for their meager breakfast, eaten in enforced silence. From there it was 12 hours of grueling labor, with only a short break for a midday meal as insubstantial as the first. The work was mind-numbing and physically exhausting, intended to leave no room for thought, no energy for rebellion. Any sign of fatigue, any whispered word, any look of defiance was met with immediate and brutal punishment from Silas or his hand-picked overseers. In the evenings, there were 2 hours of education, which consisted mostly of rote memorization of scripture and texts that emphasized obedience and the inherent sinfulness of the poor. The curriculum was another of Evelyn's designs, a tool for psychological indoctrination. The children were taught that they were at Hollowcrest because they were fundamentally flawed, that their poverty and orphan status were signs of a corrupt nature, and that only through absolute submission to the Hollowcrest authority could they hope for salvation. This constant reinforcement of their own worthlessness was a key element of control, a way to make the victims complicit in their own subjugation. The atmosphere within the walls was one of pervasive, suffocating dread. The very architecture of the place seemed designed to intimidate and oppress. The long, dark corridors echoed with the footsteps of the overseers. The narrow windows offered only slivers of the outside world, a constant reminder of their imprisonment. The silence was the worst part. It was a heavy, watchful silence, broken only by the clang of a bell, the sharp command of a guard, or the muffled sobs of a child in the dead of night. There was no joy, no laughter, no privacy. The children were under constant surveillance, their every action monitored and judged. This was the true Hollowcrest, a hermetically sealed world of fear and exploitation, a world where the sun seemed to cast no warmth and the future was a concept as distant and unattainable as the stars. The contrast between the public image and the private reality was stark and absolute, a testament to the Hollowcrest's profound cynicism and their mastery of the art of deception. They had not just built a school, they had built a lie, and they had built it to last. For years, the machinery of Hollowcrest ran with terrifying efficiency, its grim secrets protected by its isolation and the family's sterling reputation. The systematic cruelty was normalized, the atmosphere of fear so complete that active rebellion seemed unthinkable. But in the autumn of 1902, a new element was introduced into this closed system, a variable that the Hollowcrests, for all their careful planning, had not anticipated. His name was Elias Thorne, a young man of 22 who arrived at the Institute to take up a teaching position. He was not like the other members of the staff, who were mostly uneducated locals, too beaten down by life or too intimidated by Silas to cause any trouble. Elias was an outsider, a recent graduate from a modest college in the city, filled with a quiet, intellectual idealism. He had been drawn to Hollowcrest by Alistair's public pronouncements, believing he was joining a noble cause to uplift the downtrodden. He arrived with a trunk full of books and a heart full of hope, utterly unprepared for the reality he was about to encounter. From his first day, Elias felt a profound sense of unease, a dissonance between the idyllic mission he had signed up for and the oppressive atmosphere he found within the walls. He noted the children's listlessness, their downcast eyes, the way they moved with a kind of weary, shuffling gait that spoke not of youthful energy, but of profound exhaustion. They were unnaturally silent, their interactions devoid of the usual chatter and playfulness of youth. When he tried to engage them in his lessons, he was met with a wall of passive, fearful obedience. They would recite their memorized passages, but their eyes were empty, devoid of curiosity or comprehension. His attempts at gentle encouragement or a more Socratic method of teaching were met with confused, frightened stares, as if kindness were a foreign language they had long since forgotten. The other staff members were no more welcoming. They were a surly, insular group who regarded him with suspicion. His questions about the curriculum or the children's well-being were met with curt, evasive answers or a simple, That's Dr. Evelyn's way, or you'd best not question Mr. Silas. He was an anomaly, and he was being subtly, but firmly, quarantined from the inner workings of the Institute. The inciting incident, the first crack in the facade that would set Elias on his path of discovery, was a small but deeply disturbing event. One evening, a few weeks after his arrival, he was walking through a little-used corridor on his way back to his small quarters when he heard a muffled sound coming from a locked storage closet. It was a faint, whimpering cry, the sound of a child in distress. He tried the handle, but it was bolted from the outside. He called out, asking if someone was inside, but the only response was a sudden, sharp silence, as if the person within had been startled into holding their breath. Just as he was about to go in search of someone with a key, Silas Hollowcrest appeared at the end of the hallway, his heavy footsteps seeming to shake the very floorboards. His eyes locked onto Elias, a cold, predatory glare. "Lost, Mr. Thorne?" Silas asked, his voice low and menacing. Elias explained that he had heard a noise from the closet. Silas stared at him for a long, unnerving moment before letting out a short, harsh laugh. "Rats," he said. "The place is full of them. Big ones. You get used to the noise." But Elias knew what he had heard. It was not the scurrying of a rat. It was the sound of human suffering. Silas then moved past him, his massive frame blocking the closet door, a clear and unspoken warning. He leaned in close to Elias, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "A word of advice, schoolteacher," he breathed, the smell of stale tobacco on his breath. "The children here, they are not like the ones you are used to. They are liars, manipulators. They will do anything for attention. The best thing you can do is mind your own business, tend to your books, and leave the discipline to those who understand these creatures." The encounter left Elias deeply shaken. The casual cruelty in Silas's words, the veiled threat, the utter dismissal of a child's cry. It was a stark and brutal revelation. He realized that this was not a place of healing. It was a place of punishment. That night, sleep offered him no respite. The image of a locked closet door and the memory of that faint, desperate whimper replayed in his mind. He began to see the fear in the children's eyes not as a symptom of their waywardness, but as a rational response to their environment. He saw the Institute's oppressive silence not as a sign of discipline, but as a symptom of terror. The lie of Hollowcrest had been revealed to him, not in a grand exposé, but in a quiet, chilling moment in a forgotten corridor. The seed of doubt had been planted, and in the fertile ground of Elias Thorne's conscience, it began to grow into a terrifying, unavoidable truth. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had to find out what was behind that locked door, and what other secrets the stone walls of Hollowcrest were hiding. The encounter with Silas in the hallway was a turning point for Elias Thorne. The comfortable illusions he had carried with him to Hollowcrest were shattered, replaced by a gnawing suspicion that was quickly hardening into a dreadful certainty. He understood that he was in a place where curiosity was a crime and compassion was a weakness. His idealism had been a liability, but his analytical mind now became his greatest asset. He knew that any overt investigation would be swiftly and brutally shut down by Silas. He had to become a ghost, an observer moving through the shadows of the Institute, seen but not truly noticed. He adopted a mask of detached compliance, performing his teaching duties with a mechanical precision that he hoped would be mistaken for the same weary resignation he saw in the other staff members. He stopped asking questions, stopped trying to engage the children with kindness, and focused on becoming an unremarkable part of the grim tapestry of Hollowcrest. His evenings were no longer spent preparing lesson plans based on literature and philosophy, but in quiet, meticulous observation. He began to secretly document the Institute's routines, sketching out maps of the grounds in a small, coded notebook. He noted the patrol patterns of Silas's overseers, the times when certain corridors were deserted, the locations of locked doors and forbidden zones. He became a student of the Institute's oppressive architecture, learning its secret rhythms and its hidden passages. He was playing a dangerous game, and he knew it. The pervasive atmosphere of surveillance meant that a single misplaced notebook, a single lingering glance, could betray him. The fear was a constant companion, a cold knot in his stomach that tightened whenever Silas's gaze fell upon him. He felt utterly alone, an island of sanity in an ocean of institutionalized madness. His first breakthrough, though small, was significant. He began to pay close attention to the children who were singled out for special correction by Silas. These were often the ones who showed the faintest spark of defiance, a whispered word back, a moment of hesitation in obeying an order. They would be marched away to a section of the building known only as the West Wing, an area that was strictly off-limits to all but the Hollowcrests and their most trusted enforcers. The children who were taken there would return days later, if they returned at all, seemingly hollowed out, their eyes vacant, their bodies marked by a profound lethargy. Some, however, never returned. When Elias discreetly inquired about a boy named Thomas who had been taken to the West Wing and had not been seen for over a week, he was told by a grim-faced kitchen worker that the boy had been sent home. But Elias knew Thomas was an orphan. He had no home to be sent to. This lie, so blatant and easily disproven, was not a clumsy mistake. It was a statement of power. It was the Hollowcrest declaring that their narrative was the only one that mattered, that they had the authority to erase a human being not just from the Institute, but from existence itself. Elias began to keep a secret list of the names of the disappeared. Thomas, Sarah, a young boy known only as Pip. The list grew with agonizing slowness, each name a silent testament to an unseen crime. His investigation led him to focus on the periphery, on the things the Institute tried to discard. He began to search the rubbish bins behind the kitchens, a degrading and risky task he undertook in the dead of night. Amidst the vegetable peelings and coal ash, he found things that didn't belong, small, torn pieces of cloth that looked like they had been used to clean up blood, empty glass vials with traces of strange chemical smells, the kind he had noticed faintly clinging to the children who returned from the West Wing. One night, he found something that made his blood run cold, a small, crudely carved wooden bird, something a child might have made as a secret toy. He recognized it instantly. He had seen the boy, Thomas, carving it just days before he disappeared. The discovery was a tangible link to the lost child, a proof that he had existed, that he had not simply vanished into thin air. Elias kept the bird, hiding it away as a sacred, terrible relic. It was the first piece of concrete evidence in his lonely, desperate quest for the truth. He realized that the secrets of Hollowcrest were not just in what was seen, but in what was hidden, what was thrown away, what was systematically erased. He needed to find a way into the forbidden zones, into the West Wing, and into the private sanctum of Dr. Evelyn Hollowcrest, whose infirmary was the epicenter of the Institute's strange chemical pall. He knew the risks were escalating, that he was moving closer to the heart of the darkness. The question was no longer whether there was a crime being committed, but how deep the depravity went, and whether he could uncover it before he, too, became just another name on a secret list, another ghost haunting the cursed halls of Hollowcrest. To truly comprehend the depths of the tragedy unfolding at Hollowcrest, one must first understand the silent, powerless heart of the institution, its victims. The children and young adults who filled the dormitories were not the hardened criminals or moral degenerates that Alistair Hollowcrest described in his fundraising appeals. They were, almost without exception, the vulnerable, the forgotten, the socially invisible. They were orphans with no family to inquire after their welfare, children of the destitute poor souled into indentured servitude for a pittance, and young immigrants newly arrived in the country, who spoke little English and had no connections to the outside world. There were also the problem children, those deemed incorrigible by frustrated families or overwhelmed public orphanages, a girl with a disruptive imagination, a boy with a defiant spirit, a teenager who had run away from an abusive home. Their supposed faults were often nothing more than the normal expressions of childhood and trauma, but in the rigid, unforgiving world of the Gilded Age, these traits were enough to have them condemned and committed to a place like Hollowcrest. Their vulnerability was not an unfortunate circumstance. It was a prerequisite. The Hollowcrest specifically targeted individuals whose disappearance would not cause an outcry, whose absence would go unnoticed by the wider world. They were children without advocates, without power, their lives deemed expendable by a society that preferred to sweep its social problems under the rug. Inside the Institute, this powerlessness was systematically reinforced. The children were stripped of their names, their pasts, their identities. They were assigned numbers and referred to by them, a dehumanizing practice that made it easier for the staff to view them as objects rather than as human beings. Their personal belongings were confiscated upon arrival, severing their last tangible links to their former lives. They were kept in a state of perpetual hunger and exhaustion, a deliberate strategy to sap their physical and mental strength, making them more pliable and less likely to rebel. Dr. Evelyn Hollowcrest's dietary and chemical regimens were central to this process. As Elias would later discover from her stolen journals, she saw this as a scientific endeavor. In one chilling entry she wrote, "The subject's caloric intake has been reduced by a further 10%. We are observing a marked decrease in defiant behaviors and an increase in task compliance. It appears the will is intrinsically tied to the satiation of the gut. To control one is to control the other." The psychological abuse was just as relentless. The children were subjected to a constant barrage of religious and moral indoctrination that blamed them for their own suffering. Alastair's sermons, which were piped into the dining hall through a system of speaking tubes, were not messages of hope but of condemnation. He preached a twisted version of Calvinism, telling the wards that they were born into sin, that their poverty was a sign of God's displeasure, and that their only hope for redemption lay in unquestioning, absolute obedience to the authority of the Hollowcrest family. They were taught to see their own thoughts, their own desires, their own memories as sources of corruption. They were encouraged to inform on one another, to report any whispered complaint or act of defiance. This created an atmosphere of profound mistrust, atomizing the community and preventing any form of solidarity from taking root. Friendship was a liability, and trust was a danger. The children of Hollowcrest were thus trapped in a state of profound isolation, not just from the outside world, but from each other. Their stories, their individual tragedies, are the emotional core of this dark history, and it is a pain that resonates to this day. It is a reminder of how easily the vulnerable can be preyed upon when society looks away. And as we delve deeper into the specific crimes of the Hollowcrest family, it is crucial that we, the seekers of truth, do not look away. The narrative from here becomes even more disturbing, and the details more graphic. If you're finding this story as important as I believe it is, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who isn't afraid to confront the darker aspects of our history. By doing so, you help ensure these stories are not forgotten again. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel, because what Elias uncovers next will expose the true, monstrous purpose of the Hollowcrest Institute. The children's suffering was not just a byproduct of the Hollowcrest greed or cruelty. It was the entire point of the enterprise. It was the raw material for a far more sinister project, a project that would blur the lines between science, profit, and murder, revealing a level of depravity that even Elias, in his most fearful imaginings, could not have conceived. Elias Thorne's clandestine investigation had, up to this point, been focused on the immediate, observable cruelties of Hollowcrest, the brutal discipline, the pervasive fear, and the suspicious disappearances. He had assumed, with a certain grim logic, that the motive behind this monstrous facade was financial. It seemed a classic case of Gilded Age corruption, a grift on a grand scale. He imagined Alastair Hollowcrest, the charismatic preacher, was simply a master embezzler, using the Institute as a front to line his own pockets with the donations of wealthy patrons while starving and exploiting his wards. The forced labor in the cellars, the shoddy food, the threadbare clothing, it all pointed to a systematic effort to cut costs and maximize profit. This theory, while horrifying in its own right, was at least comprehensible. It was a crime born of greed, a motive as old as humanity itself. But as Elias managed to dig deeper, prying open the financial ledgers of the Institute, he began to realize that simple greed was not the whole story. It was far, far worse than that. Gaining access to the records was a high-stakes gamble. The Institute's main office, where Silas kept the books, was a fortress, locked and guarded at all hours. But Elias had become a patient student of the Institute's routines. He observed that on the last Thursday of every month, Silas would travel to the nearby town to deposit funds and carouse at a local tavern, often not returning until the early hours of the morning. This was his window. On one such night, his heart pounding against his ribs, Elias used a crudely fashioned lockpick to slip into the office. The room was just as he imagined it, stark, orderly, and smelling of Silas's cheap cigars. He worked by the slivered light of a waning moon, his hands trembling as he thumbed through the heavy, leather-bound ledgers. The first set of books confirmed his initial suspicions. They were a model of fraudulent accounting. Donations were meticulously recorded, but the expenses were a work of fiction. He saw massive, inflated invoices for food, medical supplies, and educational materials that he knew the Institute had never purchased. The profits from the workshop labor were completely absent, funneled away into a series of private accounts under false names. It was a clear and damning case of embezzlement. Alistair was indeed a thief. But as he continued to dig, he found a second, hidden ledger, tucked away in a locked drawer. This book was different. It was not a record of profits and losses, but of transactions, strange and cryptic. He saw large regular payments made to a handful of individuals, shipping agents in port cities, officials at municipal morgues, and most disturbingly, several private anatomists and medical schools known for their unorthodox research. And then there were the incoming payments, even larger and more mysterious. They came from a small, exclusive list of clients, wealthy industrialists and shadowy scientific societies, with notations that made no sense to him. Specimen A12, Batch 7, neurological tissue, premium grade. A cold dread, far deeper and more chilling than any fear of being caught, began to creep over him. This was not about saving money. The sheer scale of the secret expenditures and the even larger scale of the incoming payments suggested that the embezzlement was merely a seed fund, a way to finance a much larger, more grotesque enterprise. The Institute wasn't just a scam to enrich the Hollowcrests, it was a business, and its product was something far more sinister than cheap assembled goods. The children weren't just being exploited for their labor. They were the raw materials in a horrifying supply chain. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. The disappearances, the special treatments in the West Wing, the empty vials he found in the trash. It all began to coalesce into a monstrous, unbelievable picture. The Hollowcrests were not just murdering their wards. They were harvesting them. They were running a sophisticated, vertically integrated operation, taking in a steady supply of vulnerable, undocumented individuals, using Dr. Evelyn's scientific methods to experiment on them, and ultimately to prepare them, and then trafficking their bodies and tissues to the highest bidder in the burgeoning, amoral market for medical research. The full, soul-crushing weight of what he had uncovered threatened to overwhelm him. This was not a crime of passion or greed. This was a cold, calculated industrial-scale atrocity, hidden behind the walls of a supposed charity. Alistair's silver-tongued rhetoric was not just a cover for theft. It was the marketing for a human slaughterhouse. Silas's brutality wasn't just about discipline. It was about managing livestock. And Evelyn's science. Elias knew with a terrifying certainty that he had to see her work, her laboratory, her infamous infirmary. He had to understand the how of this monstrous equation. The financial ledger had given him the what and the why, but the true horror, the methodical, scientific heart of the darkness, lay in the domain of Dr. Evelyn Hollowcrest. He slipped out of the office just as the first hints of dawn were breaking, the secret ledger hidden beneath his coat. The knowledge he now possessed was a terrible burden. He was no longer just an observer. He was a witness to a crime so profound, so unthinkable, that he feared no one would ever believe him. But he had to try. He had to find the proof that would tear down the walls of Hollowcrest forever. Having uncovered the horrifying financial truth behind the Hollowcrest Institute, Elias Thorne knew his investigation had to escalate. The ledgers were a map of the conspiracy, but the heart of the operation, the place where the unspeakable became reality, was Dr. Evelyn Hollowcrest's domain. The infirmary and her private laboratory, located in the most isolated section of the West Wing, were the engine room of the family's macabre enterprise. Gaining access was a near-impossible challenge. The West Wing was Silas's personal kingdom, patrolled by his most thuggish overseers, and the infirmary itself was kept under lock and key, with Evelyn being the only one, besides her brother and cousin, to possess a key. But Elias had one potential advantage: his manufactured persona as a compliant, uncurious teacher. He began to feign illness, a persistent, rattling cough that he carefully cultivated. He hoped it would be severe enough to warrant a visit to the infirmary, giving him a precious glimpse inside. The ruse worked. After several days of his performative coughing fits disrupting his classes, a glowering overseer escorted him to the West Wing. The journey itself was unnerving. The corridor was colder than the rest of the building, the air thick with a cloying, antiseptic smell he had first noticed on the children who returned from special correction. The walls were stark white, and the floors were tiled, giving the entire section the feel of a morgue rather than a school. The infirmary was a small, sterile room with a few cots and a cabinet of medical supplies. Evelyn was there, dressed in a pristine white coat, her hair pulled back tightly. She examined him with a detached, clinical gaze, her eyes like chips of ice. She listened to his chest with a stethoscope, her touch cold and impersonal. As she worked, Elias's eyes darted around the room, absorbing every detail. He saw a locked door at the back of the infirmary, and from behind it he could hear a faint, rhythmic humming sound, like some kind of machinery. Evelyn, noticing his glance, offered a cold, thin smile. "My private laboratory," she stated, her voice flat. "It is where I conduct my research into improving the health and moral fortitude of our wards. It requires a sterile environment, free from interruption." She gave him a bottle of dark, viscous liquid and instructed him to take a spoonful every 4 hours. The encounter was brief, but it gave Elias a crucial piece of information: the layout of the area and the existence of a laboratory. Now, he just needed a way in. He knew a direct approach was suicide. He had to find another way. His opportunity came, as it so often did, from the Institute's refuse. During one of his late-night searches, he found a treasure trove in the bins behind the infirmary, a box of discarded papers from Evelyn's lab. Most of it was mundane, but buried at the bottom was a small, leather-bound notebook. It was her journal. Forgetting all caution, Elias raced back to his room, his hands shaking as he lit a small candle. The journal was the key, the Rosetta Stone to the entire horrific operation. It was not a personal diary filled with thoughts and feelings, but a cold, scientific log, detailing her experiments with a chilling lack of emotion. The entries were dated and numbered, the subjects referred to only by the numbers assigned to them upon entering the institute. He read about her experiments with nutrition, where she systematically starved children to measure the effects on their cognitive function and physical resilience. Subject 74, one entry read, "Has subsisted on the minimal caloric gruel for 45 days. Shows extreme lethargy and an inability to perform basic labor tasks, but compliance is absolute. Hypothesis confirmed. A weakened body cannot house a rebellious spirit." He read about her pharmacological trials, where she tested unknown chemical compounds on the children to observe their effects. She documented seizures, paralysis, and psychotic breaks with the same detached curiosity one might use to describe a chemical reaction in a test tube. Administered Compound X, 9 to Subject 82, another entry detailed. Initial response was violent convulsions, followed by a catatonic state lasting 72 hours. Neurological damage appears extensive. An excellent candidate for tissue harvesting. The prefrontal cortex should be in pristine condition, untainted by higher thought. It was in these pages that Elias finally understood the full, monstrous scope of Evelyn's work. She was not just killing the children. She was using them as human guinea pigs, systematically breaking down their bodies and minds in the name of her twisted, sacrilegious science. The goal was twofold: to perfect methods of control that could be marketed to other institutions, and to prepare the specimens for sale. The healthiest and most defiant children were subjected to her most brutal experiments, their spirits broken before their bodies were harvested. The sick and the weak were simply allowed to perish from neglect, their bodies also sold on the quiet market that Silas managed. The journal was a detailed instruction manual for murder, a step-by-step guide to turning a human being into a commodity. It was the irrefutable proof he needed, a confession written in the steady, methodical hand of the monster herself. The words on the page seemed to burn with a cold fire, a testament to a level of evil that defied comprehension. Elias sat in his small, cold room, the journal in his hands, the weight of 100 lost souls settling upon him. He knew that he held the power to expose the Hollowcrests, but he also knew that possessing this book made him the most dangerous man in the Institute. If he were caught, his fate would be far worse than simply disappearing. He would become another subject number in Evelyn's next logbook. The time for quiet observation was over. The time for action had come. The discovery of Evelyn's journal galvanized Elias, but it also plunged him into a new level of terror. He now understood the full, systematic nature of the horror, and with that understanding came the chilling realization of Silas Hollowcrest's true role. Silas was not merely a brutish disciplinarian or a simple enforcer. He was the logistical linchpin of the entire operation. He was the manager of the charnel house, the one who ensured the grim machinery of murder and trafficking ran smoothly, efficiently, and above all quietly. If Evelyn was the architect of death, Silas was its contractor, its foreman, its grim-faced delivery man. Elias began to watch Silas with a new, horrified focus, and he saw his actions not as random acts of cruelty, but as calculated steps in a dark, industrial process. He saw how Silas would walk through the dormitories or the workshop, his eyes scanning the children not as a warden would, but as a rancher inspects his livestock. He was assessing their health, their strength, their spirit. Elias realized that Silas's infamous temper and his sudden, violent outbursts were not just displays of uncontrolled rage. They were tools. They were a way to test the children, to provoke them, to see who would flinch, who would stand defiant, and who was already broken. The defiant ones, the ones with a spark of life still in them, were the ones who were often selected for Evelyn's most intensive experiments. Silas was the one who culled the herd. His domain, the dreaded West Wing, was more than just a punishment block. It was a processing center. It was where the children selected for termination were taken, isolated from the general population, and prepped for their final, horrific purpose. The special corrections were not designed to reform. They were designed to break. The beatings, the isolation, the starvation, it was all part of a methodical process to render the victims docile and to tenderize them, both physically and psychologically, before they were handed over to Evelyn. Elias now understood that the muffled sounds he heard from behind locked doors were not just the sounds of punishment, but the sounds of a human being systematically dismantled. The true logistical genius of Silas, however, lay in his management of the final stage of the process, the disposal of the evidence and the transportation of the product. The Institute's remote location, which Alistair sold as a virtue, was, in fact, a logistical necessity. It allowed Silas to operate under the cover of darkness and isolation. Elias, using his coded maps and knowledge of the patrol schedules, began to conduct daring, terrifying reconnaissance missions late at night, trying to uncover the secrets of Silas's final solution. He focused his attention on a large, ominous-looking barn at the far edge of the property, a building that was always locked and patrolled. He had seen Silas's men hauling large, heavy crates from the west wing to the barn in the dead of night. He had also seen a nondescript wagon, its canvas cover tightly secured, arriving and leaving the Institute at irregular, late-night hours, always under Silas's direct supervision. The barn, he deduced, was the abattoir and the shipping depot. One night, risking everything, Elias managed to pry loose a board on the back of the barn, creating a small opening through which he could peer. What he saw inside would be seared into his memory for the rest of his life. The interior was not filled with hay or farming equipment. It was a cold, functional space, dominated by a large, slanted stone slab with a drainage channel cut into it, horribly reminiscent of a butcher's table. In the corner were stacks of plain wooden crates, identical to the ones he had seen being loaded onto the mysterious wagon. And hanging from hooks on the wall were tools that had no place in a school or a farm: saws, cleavers, and long, sharp knives. The air was thick with a coppery scent of old blood, a smell so overpowering it made him gag. He had found the end of the line. This was where the children of Hollowcrest ceased to be children and became cargo. This was where Silas and his ghouls did their most gruesome work, dismembering the bodies of Evelyn's victims and packing them into crates for shipment to the anatomists and medical schools who were their clients. The unmarked graves the surveyors would discover a century later were for the waste, the parts of the children that were not profitable, the evidence that had to be buried deep in the earth. The full, horrifying picture was now complete. Alistair preached and procured the money. Evelyn experimented and perfected the methods of murder. And Silas, the practical, ruthless manager, handled the bloody, hands-on logistics of turning human lives into a saleable commodity. He was the one who bridged the gap between Evelyn's cold science and the sordid business of the body trade. He was the one whose hands were literally stained with the blood of the innocent. Huddled in the darkness, peering through the crack in the barn wall, Elias felt a wave of nausea and despair wash over him. The sheer scale and organization of the evil were breathtaking. This was not a handful of isolated crimes. It was a factory of death, operating with the cold precision of a modern assembly line. He knew he could not stay at Hollowcrest any longer. He had the evidence, the secret ledger, Evelyn's journal, and the terrible knowledge of what happened in the barn. To remain now would be to sign his own death warrant. His only hope, and the only hope for the remaining children, was to escape and bring this unimaginable horror to light. But escaping from a fortress managed by a monster like Silas Hollowcrest was a task that seemed just as impossible as everything else he had faced. The weight of his discoveries pressed down on Elias like a physical burden. He was no longer an investigator. He was a custodian of horrors, the sole living witness to a systematic annihilation of the innocent. The faces of the lost children, Thomas with his wooden bird, the silent, haunted girls in the sewing room, the boys with their prematurely old eyes, paraded through his waking thoughts and his feverish, sleepless nights. He knew that every moment he remained at Hollowcrest, he risked becoming another one of Evelyn's data points, another crate in Silas's barn. But more than his own fear, it was the crushing responsibility he felt for the living that propelled him toward the final, desperate act. He had to get the evidence out. The journal and the ledger were his weapons, the only things that could bring the entire monstrous edifice crashing down. The climax of his time at Hollowcrest was not a single dramatic confrontation, but a drawn-out, nerve-shredding series of gambles that began with a decision. He had to get into the West Wing one last time. He needed something more, a final undeniable piece of evidence that would corroborate the journal and shock the outside world into action. His plan was born of desperation and an intimate knowledge of the Institute's twisted routines. He knew from Evelyn's journal that she was conducting a new series of experiments with an electrical apparatus, and that she often worked late into the night, consumed by her grotesque research. He also knew that on Friday nights, Silas would receive a clandestine delivery of chemicals for Evelyn, a task that would draw him and his most trusted overseers to the main gate for at least half an hour. It was a razor-thin window of opportunity, but it was the only one he had. On that Friday night, as a storm gathered over the Appalachian peaks, mirroring the tempest in his own soul, Elias put his plan into motion. He slipped out of his quarters, a small satchel containing the journal and ledger hidden under his coat. He moved through the darkened corridors like a wraith, his senses on high alert, every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling a window pane, sending a jolt of adrenaline through him. He reached the entrance to the West Wing, his heart hammering against his ribs. As predicted, the usual guard was absent, called away to assist Silas. Using a key he had painstakingly crafted from a piece of stolen metal, a crude copy of the one he had seen on Evelyn's belt, he managed to open the lock. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing the sterile, white corridor, lit by a single, flickering gas lamp. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and chemicals. He crept towards the laboratory, the humming sound he had heard before growing louder. The door to the lab was slightly ajar. Peeking through the crack, he saw a scene from a madman's nightmare. Evelyn was there, her back to him, hunched over a large metal table upon which a small, still figure lay under a sheet. Wires ran from a humming electrical generator to needles inserted into the figure's temples. Evelyn was muttering to herself, scribbling notes into a new logbook. Subject 113, she murmured, her voice a dry, clinical drone. Post-mortem reanimation of neural pathways via galvanic stimulation. No response at 50 volts. Increasing to 75. Elias felt a wave of bile rise in his throat. He recognized the small form on the table. It was a young boy named Daniel, who had been taken from the dormitories 2 days prior for spilling a bowl of gruel. He was not just a specimen. He was a child Elias had tried to teach, a child who had once, in a rare moment of trust, shown him a drawing of a horse. And now he was raw material for Evelyn's ghoulish experiments. A surge of white-hot rage, an emotion he had suppressed for months, washed over him. He wanted to burst in, to scream, to attack her, to make her feel a fraction of the pain she had inflicted. But he knew it would be a futile, suicidal gesture. He had to stick to the plan. His goal was not revenge, it was justice. While Evelyn was distracted, he spotted what he had come for. On a small table near the door was a box of glass photographic plates. Evelyn, in her scientific vanity, was documenting her work. He grabbed a handful of the plates, stuffing them into his satchel. They were images of her victims, undeniable proof of her crimes. But as he turned to leave, his foot snagged on a loose floor tile. He stumbled, knocking over a metal stand with a clang that echoed through the laboratory like a gunshot. Evelyn spun around, her eyes widening, not with fear, but with a cold, predatory fury. For a moment, they were frozen, the teacher and the mad scientist, the discoverer of the truth and its monstrous architect. Then, Evelyn let out a piercing shriek. Silas. Intruder. The game was up. Elias didn't hesitate. He bolted, running for his life back down the corridor, the sounds of shouting and heavy footsteps erupting behind him. He burst out of the West Wing and into the main part of the Institute, a full-scale alarm now being raised. He could hear Silas's bellowing voice, ordering all exits sealed. There was no way out through the gates. He had only one desperate chance. He ran towards the back of the building, towards the kitchens, and then, using a chair to smash a window, he leaped out into the storm-tossed night. He landed hard, the glass photographic plates in his satchel clinking ominously. He scrambled to his feet and ran, not for the road, but for the forest, for the one place the Institute's rigid order could not fully extend. The forest was his only ally, its tangled undergrowth and deep shadows his only hope for cover. He could hear the hounds, a sound he had heard many times from his window, a sound that now chilled him to the very marrow of his bones. They were hunting him. The full horror of Hollowcrest was now at his back, a baying, monstrous force intent on swallowing him whole and burying its secrets with his body. The forest became a maelstrom of chaos. Rain, driven by the howling wind, lashed down in near horizontal sheets, turning the ground into a treacherous mire of mud and slick, decaying leaves. Elias ran blindly, propelled by pure adrenaline, the sounds of the pursuit echoing behind him, the deep, guttural baying of Silas's hounds and the enraged shouts of the overseers. The branches of the ancient trees clawed at his face and clothes, tearing at the satchel that held the world's only proof of Hollowcrest crimes. He clutched it to his chest like a sacred text, its contents, the journal, the ledger, the glass plates, both his salvation and his potential death sentence. He knew he couldn't outrun them, not in the long term. Silas and his men knew this terrain, this dark, tangled woodland that bordered their kingdom of pain. His only hope was to be smarter, to use the forest's own chaos against them. He plunged into the thickest, most inhospitable parts of the woods, fighting through thorny brambles and dense thickets that ripped at his skin. He waded through a frigid, fast-flowing creek, the icy water shocking his system, but hopefully masking his scent from the dogs. For hours he pushed onward, his body screaming in protest, his lungs burning, his mind a maelstrom of fear and determination. The sounds of the hunt grew fainter, then louder again, a terrifying game of cat and mouse in the tempestuous darkness. At one point, he stumbled and fell into a shallow ravine, his head striking a rock. The world exploded in a flash of white, and for a terrifying moment, he thought it was over. But the cold mud on his face and the raw, throbbing pain in his temple shocked him back to consciousness. He lay there, listening, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The baying of the hounds was more distant now, confused. He had managed to give them the slip, if only for a moment. He knew he couldn't stay there. As the first gray, watery light of dawn began to filter through the dense canopy, he forced himself to his feet. He was caked in mud, bleeding from a dozen cuts, and shivering uncontrollably from cold and exhaustion. But he was alive, and he still had the satchel. He stumbled on, his sense of direction almost gone, driven only by the instinct to put as much distance as possible between himself and the stone fortress of Hollowcrest. After what felt like an eternity, he broke through the tree line and found himself looking down a steep embankment at a muddy, rutted road. It was the main road to the town, miles from the Institute's private, winding lane. He had made it. He flagged down the first vehicle that came along, a farmer's wagon heading to market. The farmer, a grizzled man with kind eyes, looked at Elias's battered and wild-eyed state with alarm, but Elias, his voice hoarse and cracking, pleaded for a ride, babbling about an accident, a fall in the woods. Seeing the genuine terror in the young man's eyes, the farmer acquiesced, helping him into the back of the wagon and covering him with a rough burlap sack. The journey to the county seat of Williamson Creek was agonizingly slow. Every sound, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Elias half expected to see Silas and his men come thundering down the road at any moment. When they finally rolled into the small, sleepy town, Elias thanked the farmer and half ran, half stumbled his way to the one place he knew to go, the office of the county sheriff. He burst through the door, a wild, spectral figure, and collapsed onto the floor, spilling the contents of his satchel across the dusty floorboards. The sheriff, a portly, skeptical man named Miller, looked from a terrified, disheveled teacher to the strange collection of evidence. A ledger filled with cryptic entries, a journal penned in a spidery, clinical hand, and a set of glass plates showing monstrous, unbelievable scenes. Elias, his energy finally spent, began to talk, the story of Hollowcrest pouring out of him in a torrent of horrific, disjointed detail. He spoke of Alastair's sermons, Evelyn's experiments, Silas's barn, and the names of the children who had vanished. At first, Sheriff Miller listened with a look of profound disbelief. The Hollowcrests were pillars of the community, their institute a celebrated work of charity. The story was fantastical, the ravings of a madman. But then he looked closer at the evidence. He saw the cold, hard numbers in the ledger. He saw the meticulous, damning detail in Evelyn's journal. And then he held one of the glass plates up to the light. The image that resolved itself in the morning sun, the image of a child's lifeless body wired to a strange machine, drove all skepticism from his mind. He looked at Elias, then at the evidence, and his face hardened. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that the young teacher was telling the truth. The fall of the house of Hollowcrest had begun. Sheriff Miller, joined by two hastily deputized townsmen, rode out to the Institute that afternoon. The raid was not a dramatic, guns-blazing affair. It was quiet, grim, and decisive. They found Alastair in his study, practicing a sermon. When confronted, he was the picture of outraged dignity, decrying the accusations as the slander of a disturbed and ungrateful employee. His performance was flawless, but it faltered when Miller produced the ledger. Evelyn was found in her laboratory, attempting to destroy her records. She fought back with a silent, venomous fury, her clinical detachment finally cracking to reveal the feral monster beneath. Silas was the only one who put up a real fight. He was cornered in the barn, the scene of his most gruesome work. He came at the deputies with a wood axe, his face a mask of pure rage, but he was eventually subdued, his brute force no match for the law he had flouted for so long. The news of the arrests sent a shockwave through the region. The public was stunned, unable to reconcile the family's benevolent image with the grotesque crimes they were accused of. But as the investigation unfolded, the full horror could no longer be denied. The institute was searched from top to bottom. The West Wing was unsealed, revealing the torture chambers and Evelyn's laboratory of horrors. The barn was opened, its blood-stained table and grim tools telling their own silent story. And then, acting on information from a terrified, guilt-ridden staff member, the investigators began to dig in the field behind the barn. They found the graves, dozens of them. The trial of the Hollowcrest family was a sensation, a gothic horror story played out in a stuffy courtroom. Alistair, ever the performer, tried to charm the jury, to cast himself as a well-intentioned man betrayed by his troubled relatives. But the evidence was overwhelming. Evelyn's journal was read aloud, its cold, methodical cruelty silencing the entire courtroom. Elias Thorne's testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution. He spoke for days, his voice steady and clear, as he detailed everything he had seen, every crime, every victim. He was the voice of the 100 lost souls. Alistair and Silas were sentenced to hang, their crimes deemed too monstrous for anything less. Alistair wept on the stand, not for his victims, but for himself. Silas remained silent and defiant to the end. Evelyn Hollowcrest cheated the executioner. 2 nights before her scheduled hanging, she managed to synthesize a fast-acting poison from chemicals she had coerced a guard into bringing her. She was found dead in her cell, leaving behind a note that contained no apology, no remorse, only a final chilling statement. My work was unfinished. Humanity is the disease. I was merely seeking the cure. The immediate aftermath saw the Hollowcrest Institute shut down, its remaining wards transferred to other, hopefully safer, institutions. The story was a scandal for a time, a lurid fascination for the national papers. But then, as is so often the case, the world moved on. The war came, new tragedies eclipsed the old, and the story of Hollowcrest began to fade from public memory, a dark footnote in a local history book, its true horror sanitized and diminished over time. The trial and execution of the Hollowcrest family provided a sense of immediate, visceral justice, but the true legacy of their crimes proved to be far more complex and insidious. In the years that followed, a strange, collective amnesia seemed to settle over the region. The story of the Hollowcrest Institute, once a source of national scandal, became a kind of local ghost story, a dark fairy tale whispered by children, its sharp edges of fact worn down into the smooth, unbelievable contours of myth. The sheer scale of the depravity was, in a way, its own shield. It was easier for people to believe it was an exaggeration, the product of yellow journalism, than to accept that such a systematic evil could have flourished in their own backyard, funded by their own money. The powerful families, who had been Alistair's patrons, had a vested interest in burying the story, their reputations tarnished by their association with the monstrous family. They used their influence to suppress newspaper archives and seal court documents, ensuring that the full, documented truth became increasingly difficult to access. The courthouse fire in the 1930s, which destroyed many of the original trial records, was officially ruled an accident, but whispers have always persisted that it was an intentional act of historical cleansing. And so, Hollowcrest began to fade. The building itself was left to rot, too infamous to be repurposed, too expensive to be torn down. It stood for decades, a decaying monument to a forgotten atrocity, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over a valley that was trying desperately to forget. Nature began the slow work of reclaiming the land, ivy crawling up the stone walls, the forest encroaching on the once manicured lawns. The unmarked graves in the field became overgrown, their small depressions sinking back into the earth, their existence known only to a handful of locals who preferred not to speak of it. The memory of the victims, the 100 children whose lives were stolen, faded with them. They were nameless, faceless statistics in a lurid tale, their individual stories and suffering erased twice over, first by the Hollowcrests, and then by the passage of time and the deliberate act of forgetting. For Elias Thorne, the aftermath was a life sentence of a different kind. He was hailed as a hero, but the horrors he had witnessed had scarred him irrevocably. He could not escape the ghosts of Hollowcrest. He left the region, unable to bear the constant reminders, and spent the rest of his life as a quiet, solitary librarian in a distant city. He never married, never had children, and rarely spoke of his past. He had been the voice for the voiceless, but the effort had cost him his own peace. He dedicated his private life to meticulously preserving the evidence he had rescued, keeping copies of Evelyn's journal and the financial ledger, along with his own detailed notes. He lived in constant fear that the truth would be lost entirely, that the Hollowcrests, in their final posthumous act of evil, would achieve the silence they had always craved. His collection, discovered only after his death in the 1960s, became the basis for the recently uncovered documents that allowed this story to be told in its full, horrifying detail. It was his final act of witness, a message in a bottle sent across the decades, ensuring that the 100 souls of Hollowcrest would not be forgotten forever. The legacy of the Institute is a chilling reminder of how easily evil can thrive under the cloak of righteousness. It demonstrates how a charismatic leader, a methodical specialist, and a ruthless enforcer can form a perfect, self-sustaining ecosystem of corruption and violence. It is a testament to the vulnerability of those on the margins of society, and a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and blind faith. The story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How many other Hollowcrests have there been? How many other dark chapters of our history have been deliberately buried, their victims silenced, their perpetrators protected by wealth and influence? The recent rediscovery of the graves, prompted by the unearthing of Elias Thorne's private archive, has finally broken the century of silence. It has forced a reckoning, dragging the monstrous truth of the Hollowcrest family back into the light. The story is no longer a myth. The bones in the ground are real. The words in the journal are real. The suffering was real. And the responsibility to remember is now ours. What is it about the past that holds such a terrifying power? Is it the stories of monsters like the Hollowcrests, or is it the chilling recognition that these monsters were not mythical beasts, but human beings, driven by a perverse logic that festered in the shadows of a society that chose not to see? The tale of the Hollowcrest Institute is more than just a historical true crime story. It is a profound and somber meditation on the nature of evil, the fragility of innocence, and the sacred duty of remembrance. It serves as a stark, cautionary example of what happens when a society outsources its conscience, when it allows the care of its most vulnerable members to be handled by those with unchecked power and hidden agendas. Alistair Hollowcrest's genius was in understanding the deep-seated desire of the wealthy and powerful to feel virtuous without having to confront the uncomfortable realities of poverty and social decay. He sold them an indulgence, a beautifully packaged lie that allowed them to believe they were solving a problem, when in fact they were funding an atrocity. He turned their charity into a weapon, their good intentions into the foundation of a slaughterhouse. This is a pattern that repeats itself throughout history. The charismatic figure who offers a simple, totalizing solution to a complex problem, demanding absolute faith and promising a utopia, all while building a dystopia just out of sight. The story is also a harrowing examination of the perversion of knowledge. Dr. Evelyn Hollowcrest represents the terrifying intersection of intellect and amorality. In her, the noble pursuit of science became a tool for dehumanization and torture. Her journal stands as a chilling testament to the idea that intellect without empathy is perhaps the most dangerous force in the universe. She saw human beings as mere collections of data, their suffering a source of interesting variables. Her story forces us to ask critical questions about the ethics of science and the potential for knowledge to be twisted into an instrument of profound cruelty. And in Silas, we see the brutal pragmatism of evil. He was the necessary gear in the machine, the one who was untroubled by ideology or scientific curiosity. His was the evil of the functionary, the man who simply did the job, no matter how gruesome, with a chilling, workmanlike efficiency. He reminds us that for any grand, monstrous project to succeed, it needs not just the visionary and the strategist, but also the man willing to get his hands dirty, the one who will lock the door, swing the axe, and bury the bodies without asking questions. But if the Hollowcrests represent the darkness, then Elias Thorne represents the flickering, resilient flame of human conscience. He is the uncoverer of truth, the archetypal figure who, at great personal risk, refuses to accept the comfortable lie. He shows us that even in the face of overwhelming institutionalized evil, the courage of a single, observant individual can make a difference. His persistence is quiet bravery, and his ultimate dedication to preserving the truth are the only reasons this story can be told today. He is a testament to the idea that the witness has a sacred obligation not just to see, but to remember and to speak. The 100 lost souls of Hollowcrest, the nameless, powerless victims, stand at the heart of this narrative. Their tragedy is the ultimate indictment of a system that failed them at every level. They were failed by their families or lack thereof, failed by a society that saw them as a burden, and failed most horrifically by the very people who claim to be their saviors. Their story compels us to look at the forgotten corners of our own society and to ask who the vulnerable are today, and who might be preying upon them under the guise of benevolence. The history of Hollowcrest is a dark mirror held up to our past, but its reflections cast long shadows into our present. It challenges us to remain vigilant, to question authority, and to listen for the faint, desperate cries coming from behind locked doors. It implores us to be the brave souls, the seekers of truth, who are willing to dig in the cold, damp earth for the stories that have been buried. And so we are left with a final lingering question. What is our role in all of this? Is it merely to consume these dark tales as entertainment, or is it to carry the weight of their lessons forward? The choice is ours. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of history's darkest chapters. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think, then our purpose has been served. Please subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another vital story from our past. Share this video to ensure the memory of these victims is not buried again. And in the comments below, let us know your thoughts. What part of this story will stay with you? By engaging with these histories, we keep the flame of remembrance alive, and we honor the promise that Elias Thorne made to himself in the darkness of that Appalachian forest, the promise that the truth, no matter how terrible, must always be brought into the light.